What comes after you're gone? The question of succession planning is currently all the rage in the business world. It's important for businesses to know how their leadership team is going to transition over time so that the business can continue to operate. But succession planning isn't just important in the case of business. It's important in all areas of our life that have to do with long-term projects or responsibilities. It's important in our relationships. It's important in our businesses. It's important in our life of faith. If we want to know just how important succession planning is in preserving things that are important to us, our life's work, then we need look only to the example of Alexander the Great. Alexander was the king of Macedonia from a young age. He went out on a military expedition and conquered the known world. Alexander's empire was larger than any empire that had ever been made up to that point. But Alexander didn't enjoy it for decades and then die peaceably with a clear successor many decades later. Instead, Alexander died at the age of 32 with no clear successor. And the resulting conflict that broke out tore his empire up into pieces. And eventually there were 4 empires where previously there had been 1. Without a clear plan of succession, Alexander's empire didn't last any longer than he did. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been looking at stories from Israel's life during its time wandering in the wilderness. Today is going to be our last installment in this sermon series. And I want to look at the passing of the mantle between Moses and Joshua. Now, Moses, of course, inhabits an exalted place in Israel's story. He's the lawgiver. He's the one who led the people out of Israel. And he's one with whom God speaks face to face. But in spite of that, he's not indispensable in the story. Moses makes some mistakes, and God tells him that because of them, he's not going to lead the people into the promised land. When Moses finds out that it's not going to be him, his first concern is for the person who will replace him. If you read with me in Numbers 27:15-20, "Then Moses said to the Lord, 'O Lord, you are the God who gives breath to all creatures. Please appoint a new man as leader for the community. Give them someone who will guide them wherever they go and will lead them into battle. So the community of the Lord will not be like sheep without a shepherd.' The Lord replied, 'Take Joshua, son of Nun, who has the Spirit on him. Lay your hands on him. Present him to Eleazar the priest before the whole community and publicly commission him to lead the people. Transfer some of your authority to him, so the whole community of Israel will obey him.'" Now, Joshua seems like an obvious choice. Throughout the time wandering through the wilderness, Joshua has been Moses' chief lieutenant. On top of that, Joshua was also one of the spies who went into the land of Canaan and who came out with a favorable report. He was able to understand the importance of God's presence with the people. And so a person like that seems to be a good choice for Israel. And he turns out to be. While not perfect, Joshua leads the people into the promised land. So we're not trying to take over the promised land. So is succession planning as important for us as it was in Moses' day? Well, the answer is yes. In the church, we don't often call it succession planning, but succession planning really is, at its heart, discipleship. Discipleship is helping to form Jesus in the life of other people who come behind us. It's a critical mission that the church must be involved in. Why is it so important? Well, first and foremost, Jesus commands it. In the closing verses of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I've given you." But on top of that, discipleship is long-term work. Jesus told us to go and disciple all nations, and here we are 2,000 years later, and it's still not done. While Jesus may return at any time, our understanding of church history means that it would be irresponsible of us not to make preparations on the chance that he's still going to be some time in coming. And so we need to make sure that we're raising up people to follow after us. If the church cannot capture the hearts and minds of the generation that comes after it, then that church is on borrowed time. And so we cannot continue to disciple the nations unless we disciple the people in our own churches, unless we make people to replace us when we're gone. Another disturbing factor in this is that oftentimes people try to make churches that cater to specific groups of people, but it's always the same group of people that everybody wants to target, young professionals. And when we have churches that only attract young people, we often are impoverished by the lack of people who have more experience, people who can walk alongside people who need to be discipled, and who can share their perspective and their wisdom with people. Another reason why discipleship is so important is that it is the impetus for our spiritual growth. God wants us to be like Jesus. And so discipleship is the process by which this happens. But it's also the process by which we allow more people to become like Jesus. As a person becomes like Jesus, their life draws other people in. And so, it is both the means by which the church grows and the end that that growth is pointed towards. Another reason why the church must disciple is that's how it multiplies. Jesus in John's Gospel says, "I tell you the truth, anyone who believes in me will do the same works I've done and even greater works, because I am going to be with the Father." Now, of course, when we look at the life of Jesus, we might say, greater works than Jesus? But I think that Jesus means this in the aggregate. While a single one of us doesn't necessarily perform the kinds of miracles that Jesus performs, as a collective body, we can do more together than Jesus, one person, can do in one single place. Jesus tells the church to multiply. Now, this is a gargantuan task, but perhaps not quite as big as we think it is when we understand that it's about multiplication. The church can grow exponentially if the people that it disciples are equipped to disciple other people. Think about this with me, if you will. Jesus spends 3.5 years discipling 12 people. Now, at the end of those 3.5 years, what would happen if those 12 people each went out and made 12 disciples themselves? And at the end of that 3.5 years, those people went out and made 12 disciples of themselves. Well, I did the math. At 0 years, you start with 12 people. Add 3.5 years. And you go from 12 people, a small group, to 156 people, which is a good-sized church in Northern Ontario. Add another 3.5 years, you have 2,208 people, which is about a quarter of the size of Kirkland Lake. Another 3.5 years, and you're at 26,364 people, which is most of the population of the Temiskaming region. Another 3.5 years, and you're at 342,732 people, which is half the population of Northern Ontario. Another 3.5 years, you're at 4.5 million, which is about a third of Ontario's population. Another 3.5 years, you're at 58 million. That's 1.5 times the population of Canada. Another 3.5 years, you're at 753 million people, which is the population of North America, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, with the exception of Brazil and Argentina. And that is actually more people than lived on the earth when Jesus gave his order to the disciples to disciple all nations. Add 3.5 more years, and you'd be at 9.8 billion people. That's more people than live in the world. So from 12 people to the entire world takes 28 years. Now, of course, this model has lots of unworkable assumptions. It assumes that nobody dies during that 28 years. It assumes that everybody can make disciples, and it assumes that everybody can find more disciples to make when the population starts to become discipled. It's not meant to say that this is what's going to happen, so much as to say, when we understand that if we make disciples and stand up people who are able to lead other people to Jesus, that the work that Jesus has given us of multiplying the church around the world doesn't quite seem as daunting as it once did. So we've established that it's important for us to disciple one another. But there are problems. There are obstacles, if you will, to discipleship. Some of those obstacles have to do with the way that we are led as a church. And some of these obstacles have to do with the way that the people who sit in the pews respond to the leadership in the church. The first problem that we can run into is the indispensable leader. Sometimes people are busy building a ministry not to serve God, but to grow the importance of their own brand. Succession planning isn't really important to them because they can't envision whatever they're building without themselves. In the 1990s, Mark Driscoll founded the Mars Hill Church in Seattle. He's a very gifted preacher, and it very quickly became a megachurch and then a network of megachurches. In 2014, the board of Mars Hill was forced to fire Mark Driscoll when it came out that he had created a toxic and abusive leadership culture in the church. Now, within a few months of Driscoll's resignation, the whole network dissolved. It was never meant, or it was unable to exist past him because it was never larger than he was. Another similar problem comes when we have a controlling leader who doesn't empower the disciples to take up their position following him. I used to go to a church that was fairly large for the community in which it was located. And the pastor was very popular, although sometimes very divisive. Many people in the church couldn't imagine the church continuing without him. But of course, like all of us, the pastor got older. And when it came time for him to retire, the leadership at the church came up with a plan. They were going to try and hire a replacement pastor to come on and work under him as his apprentice, if you will, for a few years before the senior pastor retired. And then the senior pastor was going to continue to attend that church. What that really was trying to do was simply to replicate the pastor that they had in a younger man so that they could continue beyond where the initial pastor could lead them. But notice that God doesn't bring in Moses 2.0 when it's time for Moses to retire. Instead, God calls Joshua. In that same way, we have to understand that God doesn't call us to replicate ourselves in people in the act of discipleship. Rather, he calls us to replicate Jesus. That when Jesus' life is at work in us, we will do the things that Jesus does, but we will do them in a way that is helpful and useful and important in our own circumstances. And so for our time and our place, discipleship is going to lead us to look different and respond differently. It's not about making sure that we can make people just like us. It's about making sure we lead people to Jesus. But also, when it comes to being led, there are difficulties. The first of these is that we live in a culture of consumption that breeds passivity. Oftentimes people think of church as simply a place they go to get religious goods and services, if you will. You go to the butcher to get your meat, you go to the lawyer to get legal advice, and you go to the church to get something spiritually uplifting. And so people come through the doors expecting to be inspired, challenged, encouraged, but it always becomes simply about what they receive. We hear this when people talk about why they left a church and they say, well, I wasn't getting fed there. And it's true that the sermons, the teaching, the programming is a factor that contributes to our spiritual development. But the church isn't a place that we go to receive goods and services. Instead, it's meant to be a community of God's people where we are encouraged, but where we also encourage, where we are served, but we also serve. And so when we have come into the church with an expectation that we are just given things, and that being a Christian is simply about sitting and listening to sermons and singing songs, rather than about practicing being God's people, the discipleship doesn't really happen. It doesn't happen in those passive places. Discipleship is something that happens as we act, living out the life of Jesus in our time and place. A second thing in the way that we respond to leadership that often makes it difficult for discipleship to take hold is our culture of busyness. We live in a time where there are so many ways to spend time, and we all feel like we don't have enough of it. And when there are many things you'd like to do with your time, but little time to do it in, we end up prioritizing. Sometimes we say things are important to us, but the way that we spend our time reveals that those things aren't nearly as important to us as we say they are. So in order to say yes to certain things, we have to say no to other things. What are the things we say yes to? What are the things we say no to? That, more than anything else, is going to tell us what our priorities are. Is spending the time to become spiritually mature, doing the things and the disciplines necessary to do that, an important thing in our life? Do I spend time reading Scripture in prayer? Do I spend time serving people? Do I spend time in relationships with other people, praying with them, encouraging with them, serving with them? Or do I spend my time in some other way? That will tell us whether or not it is important in our own life to be discipled. So we've looked at why it's important to be discipled. And we've also looked at what stops us from being discipled. What is the process by which discipleship happens? In different cultures and at different times, it's going to happen in different ways. In Jesus' time, rabbis would often take a group of disciples, and they would teach them. We see Jesus going out and calling people to follow him. In our own culture, it doesn't really work that way. Oftentimes, if we go up to a person and say, hey, I'd like to be your mentor, that person might take that as a sign that you want to control them. So you need to be sensitive to the relationships that you have and know if that's something that you can propose or whether that might be something that would be seen as crossing a line. I think in our own time and place, though, it can be important for us to solicit people who can disciple us. So if you're serious about becoming a disciple of Jesus, identify people who are further along in the journey and ask if they can help you. Ask if they can encourage you, speak into your life, pray for you, if you can work through the issues that you're facing with them. Now, if you're the person who is asked by somebody else, it can be easy to be overwhelmed by it, to say, well, I'm not perfect. I got problems of my own. I don't want to help another person in this process because I fear that I'm inadequate to the task. But the thing is that we're all in process. And so if we expect to be perfect, before we are able to reach out and help other people, then discipleship is never going to happen. You have to be willing to help people even as you yourself are in the process of being discipled. There can be times when you're walking through experiences where you feel like, how could I be a help to somebody else? I have questions. I have things I'm wrestling with. Maybe you got a diagnosis that really scared you. And you're angry at God. And you're wondering, how on earth could you let this happen to me, God? Where are you in the midst of my suffering? I'm hanging on by my fingernails. But the fact that you're hanging on, even if only by your fingernails, shows that you have a faith in God. That you're willing to put the effort into trying to understand what's going on. So when a person comes to you and says, will you help me in my journey? You shouldn't say, well, I'm sorry, but I have unanswered questions. Well, we all do. Maybe the person needs to learn how to be faithful in spite of the questions. Maybe they need to know what it's like to wrestle with God, not having the answers, and just having to accept that we don't understand, and yet God calls us to faithfulness anyways. So in conclusion, the church's mission will likely extend past your lifetime. And so there's a need for us to prepare people to be the next generation of the church. Discipleship is about becoming like Jesus. Not about fashioning a person to be like you. Not about fashioning a person to be the kind of person that you think is successful. But helping lead people to Jesus. Helping them to see his life formed in them. Discipleship always deepens our dependence on God. Any discipleship that is designed to deepen our dependence on a person, a ministry, an institution is a distortion of what discipleship is supposed to be. Discipleship is never about control. It's never about trying to take the person and make choices for them. Rather, it's about leading them to Jesus so that Jesus can, by the power of Jesus' Spirit, he can form himself in them. Discipleship is really about incarnation. Jesus shows us who the Father is. And as by the power of his Spirit we are shaped in his image, our lives, both as individuals and as a collective, show the world who Jesus is. And if you've seen Jesus, you've seen the Father. And so if we want to be serious about the mission that God has given us, then we need to live as Jesus to the people around us. And this only happens through discipleship. So let's plan for our future, and let's work at encouraging those who come after us to be formed in the image of Jesus.